Great. Well, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you have joined us today for this webinar on responsible borrowing for students before they borrow. My name is Mary Dyer, and I'm a financial education program manager at FAME. And I've been at FAME for 15 years, nearly 15 years, but prior to that, I was in higher education, working in financial aid, primarily managing student loan programs. So I sat for many, many years in the seat that you are all sitting in and understand the many challenges. A lot has changed since I was in an aid office, but I know a lot of the challenges have not. So I'm thrilled that you're here today and that you're joining us. And as I said, please add comments, questions in the chat as we go along, sort of your own thoughts and reflections as well. We're in a webinar format today, so I can't hear you or see you, but certainly I'd love your feedback. One thing I want to let you know is that I will be sending this PowerPoint presentation to you. All of these slides will be made available to you, along with all of the resources and links that I'll be sharing. So please don't feel like you have to feverishly make notes or keep track of any links and resources that I'm sharing, because I'm going to send that out to all of you following the presentation. In addition to that, if you need to leave early, you got a meeting or you got to run out, we are recording the presentation, and I will make a link to the recording available to you as well. So we will, with that, go ahead and get started. So today, what I'd like to cover, it looks like a short agenda, but there's a lot within each of these topics. First of all, I want to kind of tee off the conversation with sort of what I call a student loan debt reality check. I think it's always important to kind of ground the conversation and sort of refocus our thinking around student loan indebtedness and what should we be most concerned about with students. As I said earlier, right now we're in a very strange, unprecedented time where none of those students that you're working with or who've graduated or left your school, they're not making any student loan payments and haven't since March of 2020, and no interest is accruing. And so we're kind of in this really strange time frame when it comes to the reality of repaying student loans. And so I want you to know that we've got a lot of great resources available through FAME to help once we begin Repay Restart, and a lot of resources to share with you and with your borrowers and your students. So please be sure to check back, because as we get closer to August, we understand now that August is the time frame that loans would enter repayment, August 31st. Sometime after that. So please check back on the FAME website, because we will be posting resources, information to help support your borrowers. So in any case, I think a reality check and just to check in related to the biggest concerns. Then we're going to dive into sort of the three key periods that are most critical in counseling and supporting students around decisions related to borrowing. And what I will do is within each of those key periods, we'll go through some key recommendations and resources that are available to the student and the family during those really critical times. I'll then briefly touch on an overview of, in the event that the student does have to borrow, we'll talk about federal loan programs. We'll do an overview of federal loans, an overview of private loans, and then a real quick mention or a reminder of the tax credits and loan forgiveness programs that are available as well. As I said earlier in the presentation, I have had a horrible cold this week. And so I've got my tea and my water, but if in the unlikely event I have a coughing or sneezing spell, I'll just kind of mute myself for a minute, and I'll get right back to you. I'm hoping that won't happen, and we'll be able to edit the video later if it does. So just be forewarned that there is a nasty cold going around that I'm now victim to this week. So in terms of the reality check, I think it's really important to sort of ground the conversation around student loans. We hear a lot of buzz in the media around student loan indebtedness. And right now there's lots of conversations about loan forgiveness, certainly the repayment pause, the postponement of payment. And lots of conversation in the media focused on sort of the concept of life delayed because of student loan debt. You know, the borrower with six-figure debt and, you know, really borrowers who are in a position where they can't begin those next steps or phases of their life around buying homes, cars, starting a family because of this overwhelming burden of indebtedness. And while that is certainly a concern and one that we should all be focused on and concerned about, I want to sort of ground that conversation around the actual facts and the data. And so first of all, in the latest project on student loan debt study, the average student loan indebtedness for four-year degree holders in Maine, and this is both graduates of public and private institutions in Maine, the average indebtedness was $32,764, the 10th highest debt in the nation. And I suspect that we would all agree if that was the average or the amount of debt for all four-year degree earners in Maine, we probably would feel collectively that that's reasonable. You know, that's going to translate into a $300, $350 a month payment, depending on, you know, the interest rate and the loan type and, you know, the length of repayment. But that's kind of where things stand. And again, that's the 10th, Maine is the 10th highest in the nation. Now, the reality is our students who have pursued professional or graduate degrees are the ones, and they're a very small percentage of the population in terms of high indebtedness and that six-figure debt. So I think it's really important to just remember that when we hear, you know, certainly concerns around six-figure debt and high indebtedness levels beyond, you know, the $30,000, $75,000, $100,000 mark, it does tend to be our professional level students. Now, that's not to say that we don't have a population of students in Maine who borrow well beyond the $32,000 for an undergraduate degree. So we need to keep that in check and keep that in mind along the way. But I think more importantly, I want to emphasize that when we think of the loan crisis, or sort of the biggest concern that we have among the team at FAME is, you know, the crisis around college persistence and completion. So even worse than that $32,000, $33,000 in debt upon graduation is the situation where we have students who borrowed student loans but have not completed their degree. And so now they have debt without a credential and without the capacity to repay those loans at all. What we know is that students who don't complete their degree, students who withdraw from college, are far more likely to become delinquent on their student loans and withdraw become defaulted on those loans. So those withdrawn students become delinquent borrowers, and often are the borrowers who become delinquent. What's most concerning about that population is they tend to have relatively low student loan debt. You know, I think the latest average, certainly well under 10,000, but I've seen averages of 45, 5,500. Essentially that first year loan limit, they borrow that amount and they withdraw, and they're then unable to pay. There's been other research that has, you know, stated that students are better off graduating from high school, entering the workforce, than they are incurring debt, not receiving that credential or that degree, and then having debt with no degree. You know, they're better off not pursuing education in the first place. That's a tough one for me to accept, but I think it is something that we need to consider. And so I think as we move through the presentation, obviously the decisions that students and families make early on before they select a college, before they make decisions around debt, this is a huge factor. You know, can they afford the entirety of the degree and not just that first year? And will financial issues and indebtedness stop them from completing and receiving that credential? So again, I think it's just important to reframe. It's not a conversation that you often hear on the news and the media, you know, the debt with no degree, but I think one that we need to reiterate. Now, I want to kind of tackle the three critical time periods now, but one thing I want to add is we're sort of making the assumption in this presentation that we've passed the point of sort of the early preparedness steps that students and families can take. However, that being said, certainly saving for college, setting aside money throughout the 2 or 4 years, depending on the program, in college. It's never too late for that. It's never too late to sort of regroup and focus on savings. But at this point, in the phases that we're talking about, we're well past the opportunity to save early when the child is younger, because we're really talking about before applying and selecting a school, in that those late high school years. Decisions that borrowers can make during the financing process, and then steps that they can take while in college. So we're going to assume that they've either saved or not along the way, that they have money set aside or not along the way, and how do we tackle this student loan decision making at the point in which they're actually making key decisions. And so, as I said, there's 3 critical times: before they've applied, before they've selected a school, while they're making financing decisions after they've selected a school, and then decisions that they can make while they are in college. And so I want to dive into these 3 time frames and provide you with steps and resources aligned with each. What's interesting, and the reality is that some of these are going to overlap throughout their college years. And so some of them they will go back to over and over again, but we will touch on all and take you through and provide resources. All right, so before applying for or selecting a school, now I know several of you on the webinar today are at a college, you're working in higher ed, so the students are coming to you after all of these decisions have been made. But I think it's important to kind of start early in the process. Again, for those of you who are working with high school students, working with younger students, there's a lot of decisions that are made that impact indebtedness before the student applies and before they make that final decision. We have several presentations, I'll remind you, at FAME. They're available on our website. We're also very willing to do a presentation specifically for your students, where we do a deep dive into the decision making while you are researching different schools and before applying and making that final selection. I'm doing a very high level coverage of that time frame, but certainly there's more available to you. First of all, I think a key thing as counselors to students who are working through this process is we want to be sure that students apply to a variety of schools, and that they are taking into consideration, obviously, all of the factors that allow them to select a school that are a good fit. Obviously, the type of programs that are available, certainly the setting is critical, location, all of those factors, but financial fit is also one that they want to take into account. And so it's important for them to have variety and to always be sure to include a financial aid safety school in that list. I think one of the most challenging conversations that we often have are with students and families where the student has applied to one institution and that's their dream school. They absolutely are committed to that institution, but then once they get through the financial aid process, they understand that it's simply not going to work. And so early on in the process, you want to be sure that you're helping students and guiding them in selecting a variety of schools, including financial aid safety school, or a school that they can rely on, that they know they can afford. And there's a lot of great resources to help them get to that. It's also important, and this is something they can be doing very early on before they've even begun to apply to various schools, and that is to help them to understand the net price. What is it going to cost annually for them to attend the institution after financial aid? And there are some wonderful net price calculators that will help them assess that, but really to help them get to net price versus sticker price. And that's really important because there are, a number of high cost institutions who have significant financial aid dollars to award to students. And so we don't want students to be ruling out schools just based on the, sticker price. We want them to understand what is the net price, what percentage of need does the institution meet, and what can they expect in terms of affordability? Another key step in this process is to begin having conversations about affordability and about expectations within the family and the ability to contribute. And I know that this is tricky for those of you who are working with students through this process, really encouraging families to have candid conversations about affordability and being willing to lay out sort of expectations in terms of what they can afford and what they can contribute. That's a tough conversation to encourage, but one that is critically important early on in this process. The other key step before they've selected a school is to be sure that they're comparing financial aid offers and determining the best financial fit. And that really involves doing an apples to apples comparison of financial aid offers. I recently worked with a mom who was really focused on the bottom line of the financial aid award. She wasn't really looking at the type of financial aid that had been offered. And as part of her financial aid award, the institution had packaged other loan in the financial aid package, but she was really focused on the bottom line and not looking at kind of the nuts and bolts of the award letter. How much had been offered in grants? What was the portion of the award that was available in work study? And what portion was available through student loans? And so you want to be sure that you're providing them with resources and support to compare financial aid offers. And again, you're going to hear me throughout say that FAME is available to help with this. We have resources to help with the comparison process. We will present to your students, and actually I think we've got a webinar coming up in April, as a matter of fact. It could be tomorrow night. I'd have to check the event page, but we're doing comparing financial aid offer sessions regularly to help with that phase of the process as well. We have a wonderful comparing financial aid offers tool on our website. And so last but not least, I think it's also really important when you're having these conversations is not only to sort of, show them the various tools that are available to them to understand affordability and compare aid offers, but also to provide scenarios. And so I'm going to show you some tools that I think are really helpful for that. But I think what often happens with high school students and college students and all consumers, all of us of all ages, is we start to really, I think, tune out and disconnect when the numbers get really big. When we start talking about, okay, if you borrow $5,000 or $10,000 this year times 4 years, I think sometimes it's more helpful to show them the actual numbers and show them the real information about sort of what that monthly payment will be over the course of 4 years, over a 10-year repayment term, than it is to focus on kind of that 1 year picture. The other thing that's critical, and I got some great resources on the next slide, is to help them understand how much income will be needed to support that debt. Generally speaking, we recommend that no more than 8 to 10% of their income, or no more than their first year of their salary, essentially equal their student loan debt. So I think a good rule of thumb, and it doesn't quite work out to 8 to 10%, is for them to understand what they're going to make in their first year of employment for the career that they're pursuing, and be sure that their student loan amount doesn't exceed that. And if it does, to help them understand the repayment options that are available to them should they need a different repayment strategy because their loan has exceeded that amount. So some resources and tools. I want to just check questions real quick. Yes, Jennifer, your question, there's a question in the chat as to whether that 32,000 I quoted, that was just federal debt. Actually, and I think this is relatively new, you can get the average private debt for Maine borrowers as well. And then thank you to Maria from FAME for offering to be my moderator or helper, said should my cold take over. So thank you. But certainly keep entering questions and comments in the chat. So tools and resources that are available for students and families before they're applying and as they're going through that school research and selection process. As I mentioned, net price calculator. Every institution who offers financial aid is required to have a net price calculator on their website. And that's a tool that students and families can be using before they apply at the institution. So net price calculator, it's a great resource to help them get started in evaluating the overall cost and affordability. Another website that we recommend, and again, don't need to jot these down, I'll send you all of the links. The College Board Big Future site is a wonderful tool because it will allow you to search colleges based on a whole variety of factors: location, size, selectivity, how difficult is it to get into the school, certainly all of the programs that are available. But the other thing I like about it is it will also allow you to search schools based on affordability and percent of need met. So you can actually do a search of institutions where you can filter based on the percent of your need that the institution covers. And so I think that's a great tool, and it's one that we used when my son was applying to colleges. I really wanted to get my head around sort of the percent of need met at the various schools that he was interested in. So I strongly encourage that. The Department of Ed, the college scorecard, this is another wonderful resource that families can use, and it allows them to research colleges based on a variety of factors. But one of the things that you can get from College Scorecard that I think is really helpful is the median earnings for graduates at those various institutions. So you're able to research an institution and get the median earnings. College Navigator is also another place that I think can be useful, although I find College Board and the scorecard a little easier to manage. There's a lot of information in College Navigator, but I think as a professional, if you're working with a student, it's a great resource to help you sort of gather more information about financial aid for specific institutions. As I mentioned, we have a whole variety of resources at FAME as well. We have a wonderful tool of conversation starters. It's a one-page series of conversation starters that are very focused on the affordability topic. And so it's a great way, perhaps it's a tool that you might send home with your students or use with families, but it's a great tool to begin that engagement and to have that conversation regarding expectations and affordability. As I also mentioned earlier, we have a wonderful comparing costs and financial aid offers comparison tool where you can actually enter the information from your financial aid offer and enter in the scholarships and grants and get a cost prior, sort of that remaining cost prior to student loans, and then you can add in the student loans. And so it really allows you, and you can enter multiple scenarios. And so it helps you to get a sense of your overall commitment and the affordability in a sort of apples to apples comparison. And then the last tool I really like is just a straight up bankrate.com student loan calculator. And I've got some more student loan calculators that we'll talk about in the next section. But I want to show you an example. When I talked earlier about showing them versus telling them, I did an example on the next slide that I want to show you that I think kind of gets at what I was saying earlier. I'm just going to take a little sip of my tea here. So the first chart, I did various levels of borrowing for tuition fees, room and board. And so assume, this is a student who they received some financial aid, but then they needed to borrow beyond their grants and scholarships. So that 10, 15, 20,000, this could be comprised of both federal and private loans. Or all private loans. So I went in and did some real quick calculations, and I think I ended up doing like a 4.5% interest rate. So the great thing about Bankrate is you can put in the total amount borrowed, based on a certain number of years, you can then put in the repayment term, and it will give you some really clear information. So as we talk to students about annual borrowing, so in this case, you may have a student who says, well, it's $10,000 this year that I have to borrow to get the bill paid. No big deal. But let's look at that over 4 years. And this is, again, something that might be helpful to show the student by using Bankrate. So $10,000 in the first year, assume that that's the amount that they borrow over 4 years. That gets them to $40,000 overall. And then again, these are averages because there's some things that you can't account for on Bankrate. But their 10-year payment for that is $415. The total interest is close to $10,000. And their total amount that they will have repaid on that $10,000 over 10 years is basically $50,000 if we round up a bit. So if you show that to the student that, yeah, it's only $10,000, but look what happens over time. And look at the annual income that's needed to support that $50,000 in debt. And it only gets worse as you move ahead. So if we compare that to the $20,000 amount, that's $80,000 over 4 years, an $800 monthly payment, nearly $20,000 in total interest, with $100,000 repaid total. And as you can see, the annual income needed is $155,000. And I'll show you how you can help them understand that annual income figure. So that's if we're just talking about borrowing for tuition and fees and room and board, which for many students is an imperative, that for the vast majority of students, student loans are part of that total financing picture. And so that is just a reality. But let's take a look at the indirect expenses. So if a student were to borrow beyond just tuition fees, room and board, and they're borrowing for books and supplies and travel and personal expenses. And again, I just threw some, standard numbers in there, annual borrowing of $3,000, $6,000, and $8,000. And so at a minimum, I think it's interesting, if you look at $3,000 in indebtedness, spread over 4 years, gets them to $12,000. Their 10-year monthly payment, $124, $3,000 in interest. And so again, you can see all of the numbers there. I don't need to cover them all, but the annual income needed for just that $3,000 in indirect expenses is $23,000. So you can see very quickly how students can get into this scenario where they have borrowed more than their income can support. And so how can we help them to impact that? How can we help them to make decisions that reduce that total indebtedness over time? And I think indirect expenses are clearly an area that they may be able to impact. So again, this is just a quick calculation that you can get from Bankrate. But I think it's one that's really important because I think all of us as consumers have a very difficult time conceptualizing these numbers. When we say, okay, you're going to borrow $5,000 to get the bill paid or $10,000, what does that really mean over time? And what does it really mean in terms of income requirements to be able to afford that payment? All right, I'm going to pause here just to check for questions. I don't think. Not seeing any now, so please feel free to send them my way. All right, so now we have selected a school, we've made the decision, we've confirmed, and now we got to figure out how to get the bill paid. So this is another critical point where decisions around borrowing can really be impacted by critical steps and information that is provided. So during the financing process, again, lots of resources and help to ensure that the student is exhausting all of their scholarship, grant, and non-loan options. We want to be sure that they apply for financial aid on time, that they apply every single year for which they're planning to be enrolled. We want to also ensure that they are researching and applying for outside scholarships. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Some of these steps overlap. We have many students that junior and senior year, they're very focused on applying for outside scholarships, but once they get to college, they sort of forget that that's an option. So we want to be sure that we encourage them to research and apply for outside scholarships throughout their college career. They want to be sure that they're continuing to pursue those opportunities for free money and non-loan options. If at all possible, I think it's important to talk to your financial aid counselor, talk to the financial aid office, and make sure you're asking all of the various questions related to financing. Once they've been offered a financial aid package, it's really important to understand, can they expect that offer every year, over the course of the degree program? What is the impact of outside scholarships? Should they receive them? Kind of what are the expectations over time? Again, this is also a great time to reach out to FAME and make sure you're accessing all of the free counseling and resources that we have to offer. So after certainly financial aid, outside scholarships, all of those opportunities have been exhausted. Another recommendation that we make that is a really great strategy before loans is to consider a tuition payment plan. And a tuition payment plan is exactly what it sounds like. It allows the student and the family to spread the cost of tuition out over a longer period of time, so they're not having to pay that all at once. The upside of a tuition payment plan is that it doesn't accrue interest during the time that you're repaying. There is generally a one-time enrollment fee, generally between $50 to $100, depending on the plan. But it's a really great way to spread the cost of tuition out over a semester or an entire 10-month period, depending on the institution. Think of a tuition payment plan if your child had to have braces and the orthodontist allowed you to spread those payments out over time. That's a tuition payment plan. And it's a really great solution after you've factored in scholarship and grant before student loans. And it can be used in combination with other financing options, including student loans. The other thing we want them to be really aware of, again, the bank rate calculation that I just showed you is a great step to take them through as they're making their decisions. But we want them to understand their future earning potential and the recommended debt level tied to that. So that's a nice early step as they're going through that financing option process to use the tools that are available. And then should they have to borrow, as always, we recommend that they borrow federal loans first and only borrow what is needed, and ideally only borrow for those direct costs. You saw on the previous slide what happens when they're having to borrow for indirect costs as well. And we'll talk about ways to help mitigate that. But certainly knowing, trying to limit that borrowing every single year over time is going to make a significant difference. The other thing that they should know is that it's okay to decline or return loan funds. If they get a refund check and they really feel like they can make it with their other, perhaps they have a part-time job or they don't need the entire refund, they're living at home or on campus and they've got their costs covered, certainly they can decline the total loan amount or return the loan funds as well. So just to always ensure that they are aware of that they're not locked in up front. So some of the resources and tools that are available during the financing process. Obviously, the free application for federal student aid is available at fafsa.gov. They want to be sure, as I said, to apply for financial aid on time every single year and complete all of the various college-related financial aid requirements as well. It's not, in many cases, a one and done. You do the FAFSA and you're good to go. There may be additional requirements that are needed. When I was working in financial aid, I will tell you that the students who struggled most commonly were those who had done their FAFSA on time for their first year, and they received essentially an on-time financial aid package. But then in the subsequent year, they didn't fill out the FAFSA and they lost grants and scholarships that really really hurt them and impacted their ability to pay, and in turn, for many of them, impacted their indebtedness level. So making sure that students and families understand that they have to complete the FAFSA on time every single year and complete all of those various college-related requirements, financial aid requirements, that is critical. If they need help, as always, reach out to the financial aid office, but reach out to FAME and take advantage of all of our free FAFSA completion support and resources. Our college access and financial education team will do one-on-one financial aid counseling sessions with you via Zoom. And so any time that you have questions or you need help with the process, certainly feel free to reach out. Just had to take a little cough break there. I'm pretty impressed I made it this far. It's a mouthful. Another tool that we want you to be aware of is FAME's main-based scholarship search tool. So that's another resource that's available to them, and they are able to filter based on whether or not they are in high school, whether or not they are already in college. And there's also some filters based on the program of study. So again, check out the scholarship search tool and promote that resource to your students as well. Now, in terms of getting a handle on their expected income, we strongly encourage them to use Career One Stop. They can go in and actually put in virtually any career and indicate the state that they plan to live in, and it will give them the median income for that career. I think it's imperative that the student understand the salary for the program that they are pursuing. And then from there, once they have that information, they can go to the student loan salary debt calculator, and they can enter the amount of student loan debt, and it will tell them the salary they'll need to support it, or they can actually put in the salary, and it will kind of give them the maximum. The tool works in reverse. So I strongly encourage you to share those resources as well. All right, and so while they are in college, and I hope our financial aid professionals on the webinar today will chime in and share in the chat other strategies. But it's still not too late to make decisions that impact indebtedness. Reducing college-related expenses is critical. Now, obviously, it's expensive to go to college, right? For many students, there's not a lot that you can do necessarily once you're enrolled to impact the tuition fees, room and board, but there are a lot of expenses that you can control. And so creating a budget while you're in college and sticking to it is really important. Some key things that you can think about to reduce expenses: encouraging them to buy used or rent their textbooks. Thankfully, this is just easier than it ever has been. Back when I was in college, it was hard to get used textbooks and there weren't the online options. But now it's really easy to save money on textbooks. Get a roommate. Unless you have mitigating circumstances, if you're living on campus, don't pay the extra for a single room. Have a double, maybe a triple, or even a quad. Save money if you can. If you're living off campus, get a roommate. Keep an eye on coffee and meals out. This is an area of discretionary spending that can really add up. And remember that calculation I showed you on the indirect expenses. If they have a full room and board package, but they're eating meals out, they're paying for that meal twice every single time. Another way that they can reduce their expenses is to reconsider bringing the car to campus. Perhaps they leave the car at home and save on gas and parking fees and all of those things. Some great suggestions in the chat. If students need assistance with living expenses, I recommend that they consider being an RA on campus to help with room and board. That's a wonderful strategy. And then another recommendation is living at home with parents. If that's an option, you can save big on room and board. And so that's something to consider as a way to cut costs. So certainly those are just a few things. We have a section on the FAME website that does a deeper dive into all of the strategies to save while you're in college. Now, also, I think establishing a plan to cover those indirect and discretionary expenses at a minimum. Students should be prepared through summer earnings or work study to help cover the cost of books and supplies at a minimum. I think a reasonable expectation is that the student in that summer leading up to their enrollment in college, that they earn $2,000-3,000 or more to help cover those indirect expenses. And again, if we look at that total indebtedness picture in the earlier slide, think about the impact that that can have over time. So students really want to be sure that they're taking advantage of any of those opportunities to work and contribute along the way to the indirect expenses in particular. And as I said earlier, using loan money to only cover the critical and direct expenses. So some of the resources and tools for this while in college, while they're making those borrowing decisions ongoingly. First of all, if they haven't already, we want them to sign up for iGrad. FAME has its own what I'll call generic iGrad site. But the University of Maine system, the Maine Community College system, Thomas College, Maine College of Art and Design, they also have their own custom iGrad site as well. And so iGrad is a digital online financial wellness tool that helps them to get their finances in order. There are budgeting resources, courses that they can take. There's a My Money personality analysis. Just a whole wealth of resources to help them get their finances in order and really begin to build upon their financial wellness while they're in college. Another tool that I learned about recently, and I'm not endorsing it because I haven't actually purchased or used the app, but I've heard a lot of great things about the You Need a Budget app, the YNAB app. There's a lot of budgeting apps out there, Mint and various budgeting apps that are available through your financial institution that you can link them to your your credit card or debit card. But this one in particular keeps cropping up as one that seems to be really motivating for younger people, especially. Another tool that you may want to use with your students, for those of you who are working with high school students, is Next Gen Personal Finance has a whole host of games and curriculum and tools to help students understand the impact of debt long term. And they have a couple of games that you might want to check out, the Payback Game and Spent. Again, I really wanted to share those resources specifically for those of you who are working with high school students. And then on our website, if you go to famemaine.com/money-management, you'll find lots of resources there as well to help with the whole financial wellness piece. All right. So those are all of the key critical points and all of the resources. So I want to touch on in our last 15 minutes or so, if the student is going to borrow, where should they turn? What is the best path in terms of borrowing? So why do we say federal loans first? Why federal loans in terms of, where to turn if borrowing is part of the picture? First of all, flexible repayment. It sounds kind of funny to say that now where nobody's repaying at the moment. So certainly it's flexible repayment is proving to be true right now in this time. But certainly under normal circumstances, there are a variety of repayment options with federal loans that don't exist with other loan programs. And so certainly that can really help if you're working with students who, they know that they're going to be in a lower wage career, perhaps a public service career, they're planning to teach or work in social services, but they know that they're going to have to take on a little bit more debt or more debt than they can actually afford. And so it's really helpful for those borrowers to know that there are income-driven repayment options. There is a graduated repayment option, an extended repayment option. There are also deferment options available to them as well. I mentioned public service loan forgiveness. Certainly this is an area that we're very focused on right now because of the current public service loan forgiveness waiver. or the temporary waiver that's available. But we know that for federal loans, if they are working in a public service, for a public service employer, there are forgiveness options available to them. So that's another consideration and why federal loans may be more advantageous. I'm going to put a plug in for a webinar that we're doing on May 13th that's specifically focused on the public service loan forgiveness temporary waiver. If you go to the famemaine.com/events, you can register for that webinar, but we're bringing national expert Betsy Mayotte back to do another webinar. We did a webinar for professionals. This one is for consumers and employees and the borrowers. So certainly take a look at that and join us for that webinar if you weren't able to join us for the earlier one. So public service loan forgiveness, another key component of the program that doesn't exist in other programs. Certainly, we don't like to talk about it, but there are cancellations available due to death or disability that don't always exist. Certainly fixed and possibly lower interest rates. I know we've been in some environments where private loans have lower rates than federal loans, but historically over time, the interest rates tend to be lower on the federal side, at least for the student. Certainly not in the case of the Federal Plus loan, but certainly for the student. And then also there's no credit check or cosigner required for students. And these federal loans are typically included on their financial aid award as well. But again, asking lots of questions about the expectations and the obligations over time. Now, in terms of the federal direct loan program, these are available to both undergraduate and graduate students. They do have to attend school at least half time. There are two general categories of loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized loans. The subsidized loans are need-based. As I said, typically included on the award letter, no credit check required, and the current interest rate is 3.73, and the interest doesn't accrue while the student is in school. So subsidized loans, and students really want to be very clear when they are applying for their federal loan or accepting their federal loan, whether or not it is subsidized or unsubsidized. Alternately, the unsubsidized loan is not need-based. It is still included, generally speaking, on the award letter. There's no credit check required. The interest rate is 3.76 for undergrad, 5.28 for grads, and the interest does accrue while they're in school. And then last but not least, there are federal direct plus loans that are available to both parents and graduate students. These are not need-based. They may be included on the award letter, so you want to keep an eye out for that. There is a credit check required, but they can come in really handy to help pay for expenses that might not be covered by the other types of financial aid. And so you want to check out that option. Currently, the interest rate is 6.28. So again, I'm not making specific recommendations, but you want to really weigh the various pros and cons of federal direct plus versus private loans from an interest rate perspective. There's a lot to consider there. And I am going to turn over to the private loan section, but I want to check our questions real quick. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm thrilled, Maria. Thank you for including the link to Payback. It's a wonderful game that NGPF has created. So thank you for including that link. I will send it in the email follow-up. The reality is that there's actually several games on the NGPF website. And so Payback is just one of them. Spent, I mentioned, there's also a budgeting game. There's a whole variety of games that NGPF makes available. And then Jennifer, do I have a typo in my interest rates on my previous slide? Jen asked if the interest rates were different. I'm going to have to go back and check that. Maybe Maria, as my impromptu wing woman, can confirm that. Now I've lost my chat here. Let's take a look. Interest rate from unsub, really different from sub. What did I do here? I think I have a typo there. I think I do. Maria, can you confirm and put that in the chat, and I'll go back to that in a moment. I can't tell you how many times we proofed the webinar. Anyway, so let's talk about private loans. Private loans work similarly to the PLUS loan program. They can help bridge the gap between the cost and the financial aid that has been offered. So they're not need-based. You can actually apply for private loans up to the cost of education minus any financial aid. Private loans are offered by private lenders. So exactly sort of what you would expect. Certainly FAME, and there are a variety of lenders in Maine that offer private loans. And so you want to check out the information on our website if you're curious about that and you're interested in loans specifically from FAME or Maine borrowers. Usually the private loans are separate from the financial aid office, and they're not separate from the financial aid process in that they're generally not included on the financial aid offer. But as I mentioned earlier, some institutions will include other loan, and really the idea behind that is presenting the eligibility to the family for potentially a private loan or a PLUS loan. So it sometimes can be included, but not generally. Private loans, unlike the federal direct loans for students, are credit-based. So there is a credit check required, and usually in virtually all cases for undergraduate borrowers, a cosigner is usually required. All right, thank you, Maria, for confirming. I had a typo there. The undergraduate sub and unsub interest rate 3.73, and the graduate unsubsidized rate is 5.28. So I had that one right. Thank you, Jennifer, for pointing that out. And then these interest rates, as Maria also points out in the chat, is these were the rates from July 1st of 2021 through July 1st of 2022. We could see an interest rate shift coming up soon. So that is yet to be determined. So things to consider when exploring private loans. Obviously, you know, you want to be really clear about the interest rates and fees. Is it a fixed rate or variable rate? You want to understand, and this is presented as part of the application process, the APR, or the annual percentage rate. This is the total cost of borrowing, including fees and interest over time. You also want to be clear of repayment and deferment options. You know, what is offered should the student or family encounter, you know, an economic hardship? What if the student returns to school? What are the repayment and deferment options that exist? Obviously, who you're dealing with when you're going through the process of borrowing and repayment. What is the customer service, you know, lender reputation, experience, all of that. Other things to consider, certainly the application process. What are the loan amounts that are available both annually and over time, that aggregate amount? The repayment term, you want to be really clear about the term. And again, any of those deferment or repayment options. Prepayment penalties, if there are any, we see that very infrequently. But also another thing to be aware of is the cosigner release. So again, as I mentioned, most undergraduate students do have to have a cosigner, but is there an opportunity over time to have a cosigner release? And then last but not least, before we wrap up, I just want to put a reminder out there for the various tax credits and loan forgiveness programs. I'm not sure, I haven't seen the recent data regarding the Opportunity Maine tax credit, but last I knew it was still a relatively underutilized tax credit. So you want to be sure that you check out and provide information to your students regarding the Opportunity Maine tax credit. And this allows borrowers to receive a tax credit for student loan payments if they are living and working in Maine upon graduation. So that's a really beneficial credit. There also are some federal education tax credits. The American Opportunity Tax Credit and Lifetime Learning is kind of when they're in college, there's a tax credit that they can claim in the following year after they've paid tuition. But then once they're in repayment, there's also a student loan interest deduction that's available on the federal side as well. All of these tax credits and the details related to them can be found in IRS publication 970 if you want more information about that. And then as I mentioned earlier, there are federal loan forgiveness programs, public service loan forgiveness, teacher loan forgiveness. I encourage you to join the webinar on the 13th because Betsy will do a deep dive into public service loan forgiveness in general, but then she will also talk about the temporary waiver that is currently available that will expire on Halloween of this year. So it's only available until October 31st, but I encourage you to join us for that webinar because again, she'll get into all of the discussion about eligible employers, eligible loans, and everything that you need to know about public service loan forgiveness. And so last but not least, just, certainly a reminder, I truly appreciate all of you being on the webinar. I know that you already know that you are a key influencer and the guidance that you provide at all of those key points and the resources that you offer to them really can make a lifelong impact on their financial stability. All of those resources can really hopefully help them to make informed decisions regarding their borrowing. Ways that you can help, obviously creating opportunities to discuss affordability. And as I mentioned, we're more than happy to have, to offer a presentation to your students around affordability and how to research schools based on cost. The financial wellness, promotion of financial wellness, anything you can do to get the word out about iGrad and the availability of iGrad to your students and the resources that are available through iGrad can really go a long way in keeping the financial aspects of their decision-making top of mind. So certainly, encourage them to sign up for iGrad and use iGrad as often as possible. Think about ways that you can embed information about iGrad in all of your existing communications. As I mentioned, encouraging them to reach out to us and take advantage of our free counseling and resources that we offer. And then remember, to you and to the families that you serve, don't go it alone. We're here to help. If there's something that we don't have, a tool that you think could be useful through this decision-making process, certainly let us know. We are here to help, and we're always looking for new ways to engage students and families on this topic. Before we conclude for today, I wanted to let you know about our upcoming webinar on May 11th at 1 o'clock. The topic for our next Wednesday webinar is Saving for Higher Education, Debunking the Myths and Sharing Resources. So this is all about really debunking that myth that if you save for college, it's going to hurt your financial aid prospects. So we hope that you'll join us for that. You can sign up for that by going to famemaine.com/events. You'll also find the May 13th webinar, and I'm pretty sure, and I'll include the link in my follow-up, I'm pretty sure we've got a webinar coming up relatively soon on comparing as well. So I hope that you'll check that out. I'm amazed when I visit the event page how many presentations we have in the pipeline for students and families and professionals. So please check that out if you haven't. And then last but not least, certainly you can reach out to us anytime via email, give us a call, visit our website. I also encourage you, if you're not following us on social media, to do so as well. We've got a great campaign right now going on for April as Financial Literacy Month. So feel free to follow us and share any of the posts that we've put out there to encourage financial wellness during this month of recognition. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope that we'll see you next month. I'm going to